Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give it just a few minutes to let people keep filing in. But while we're waiting, if folks want to start introducing themselves in the chat, if you just want to say where you're calling in from, maybe your organization, if you want to update your name with your preferred pronouns, that would be great. You can click the three little dots at the top of your thumbnail and click rename. You can also add your location in there. We'll get started in just a few minutes.
I'll try with that light to see if it makes it better. But hi, everybody.
Hi to those that just joined. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes to let folks keep filing in. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, including where you're calling in from. This is one of the most fun parts to me, to see people coming together from across the country. So exciting stuff. Okay, I'm going to give it just one more minute and then we will kick things off. And one more time, hello to anyone who just joined. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and including where you're calling in from, and we're gonna get started. We've got a lot to get through and wanna make sure we have lots of time for some good conversation. So I'm gonna share my screen really quickly and get this started. So welcome everyone. My name is Sheyda Esnaashari, and I am the Drinking Water Program Manager at River Network. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois. I've been with the organization for a little over a year now, and I'm really excited to be here with you all. Felipe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm the one hugging the tree, and that was, I think, in California. I'm also on the record hugging a tree, so you Google my name and NPR, you'll find me. It was an interview that they made during a tree climbing competition, so it was a fun one. Executive Director of Corazón Latino. I'm a proud immigrant, a dad, and I've been in the working on the space between immigration, Latino communities, and conservation for the past, oh my God, 17, 18 years. I founded Corazón Latino a few years ago, and the goal, our mission is to reconnect Latino communities with nature and create stewards, not even create, it's really just foster that knowledge, experience, and connection with the land that Latinos have. So we do that in almost 14 states. We have offices in DC, or virtual offices right now in DC, in Arizona, and in Puerto Rico. We have a very fun project there in Puerto Rico, many projects actually. And that's it. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Great, thank you, Felipe. So I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of the run of show here for today. So we're going to open up the space in a pretty intentional way. We're going to go through a little bit of interactive presentation conversation around some basics around community engagement and things to think about. And then Felipe is going to share a little bit more about his work and how they approach community engagement, specifically with the Latinx community, but with lots of useful information for engaging all sorts of different kinds of communities. Hopefully we will have time at the end to move into breakouts. The last session we did, we ended up just having a big group conversation in the interest of time. And I know people have I've been having Zoom issues with breakout rooms, but this will be highly interactive and there will be lots of time for conversation, questions, and that sort of thing. So without further ado, so I wanted to start out opening up the space with community agreements and a diversity welcome. So walking through the community agreements, first, center and ground yourself, whatever that means to you, limiting distractions, taking a deep breath, making sure you have coffee, water, whatever you need to make you feel comfortable. Take care of yourself if this means turning off the camera to feel more comfortable engaging in this space. If you need to walk away, take a bathroom break, attend to other things in your space. We understand that this is a unique time to be living in, and do what you need to take care of yourself. Respect confidentiality. I think this really, we are recording this session and it will be available to the public, but this will really come into play during the breakout sessions, and respect that everybody is telling their story and it's their story to tell, not yours. Take space, make space, listen to understand, respond with curiosity, speak up if you normally don't, and take a step back if you know that you tend to contribute a bit more. Good eyes. So respecting diversity are experiences and assuming positive intent, but also consider your impact. So consider the weight of your words and how they may be received. And then finally, seek growth from discomfort. So get out of your comfort zone, take lessons from things that initially may challenge you and your perspective. I'd like to open it up to invite any additions to our, look at the chat, to the community agreements. If anybody wants to pop in the chat, or if you want to come off of mute and share an additional community agreement that you'd like to add, feel free to do so. Okay, we'll keep that open, so if you think of something, feel free to pop it in the chat. The next piece I wanted to do was just a diversity welcome and welcome all different identities to the space. I want to welcome all races and ethnicities. All gender identities are welcome here. All people managing chaotic home lives while working from home, kids, partners, etc. All people who are zoomed out. All people that are feeling intense anxiety and or grief with the current news cycle, the upcoming election. All people carrying the weight of continued racial injustice and violence. And all frontline workers who have not seen a break from the pandemic, even if it feels less jarring than it did at the beginning. And again, I open it up to you all if you want to add to the welcome. Feel free to use the chat or again, come off of mute. Don't be shy. Okay. Again, I will leave that open if you think of things you want to add. So, okay, so we're gonna start out with a little bit of conversation here. So I wanna take a second for you all to reflect on what your definition of engagement is. I'm gonna change my view so I can see this, and type your response in the chat. I'm gonna actually come out of presentation mode so that we're gonna populate this as they come in. is. And again, for anyone who just joined, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, as well as send along your thoughts on the definition of engagement. I love seeing these come in. Thank you for sharing. Felipe, do you want to call out some that are resonating with you?
I was on mute, sorry about that. I think I'm liking everything that I'm saying. It's about beyond just, it's a two-way street, it's about listening, but I really like what Hannah mentioned. It's humility. Humility, listening, and relationship building. And I like that she started with humility because it is a very important element. And just, I mean, listening by definition or in theory should be about just letting others present their point of the world. But I think it is important, and we'll talk about it later on this presentation. Is really about understanding and being open that there's different ways of doing things, especially in our work, in conservation, and in public lands, in recreating in rivers. There's not a right or a wrong way. There's just different ways. And that humility comes in recognizing those differences and coming into leaving aside what people refer to as a white savior complex, that I know what's good for your community. I know what I'm going to tell you how to do recreation right. I know I'm going to teach you how to care for the land or for rivers. And I think that humility is very important in the work that we do. So that one stood up really nicely for me. So thank you, Hannah, for that comment.
Yeah, I like that too. And just like the amount of self, in order to have humility, there's a certain amount of self-awareness and awareness of your own worldview that you come into this with, which I really appreciate. I really like the two-way conversation and already trying to differentiate between outreach and engagement. I think that's a really important distinction to make. So we're seeing that pop up a couple of times. I like this last comment that came in about authentic relationships and connections. And I think we'll get into some more definitions in a little bit, but this relational piece is really important to me. In my engagement work, and I think in most people's, in order to do it well. And thank you, Gloria, for calling out the savior complex, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. Thank you all so much for sharing. Felipe, any others that you wanted to call out or invite more from?
I like that. I think there's a really great consensus about the co-learning, listening, sharing, two-way, being humble. So I like that we're starting from a common ground. Does anybody have any reactions, comments? We'd like to open it to the folks.
Yeah, feel free to come off of mute and go ahead and chime in. We have a shy group today.
We do.
I'll chime in here. Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah from Durham, North Carolina. I just wanted to say I really liked this format of you sort of live typing while we enter into the chat, and I am definitely going to use this method. I think this is similar to kind of like the sticky note technique or like other sort of in-person techniques that we're used to with community engagement. So this is a great sort of virtual version of that. So thanks for sharing this facilitation resource. I really appreciate it.
Of course, yeah. And I've seen it in other Zooms, so I think we're just like grabbing, you know, taking from other people. So I appreciate that it's working well for you. Anybody else want to like, are there specific things that are resonating with you all that you didn't necessarily think of, or things that you want to expand on what you've said since seeing this list that we've compiled together?
I'll share something. This is Rebecca. We're getting ready to do a strategic plan for our organization, 5-year strategic plan. So I've been thinking a lot about community engagement and how to have that inform our planning process and our new set of strategic priorities. So I've been spending a lot of time in this space trying to figure out how to do it well. And you know, one thing that's really shifted in my perspective over time is even coming into spaces with new potential partners or stakeholders, knowing the set of questions you want to ask. So even stepping away from that level of kind of knowing already what can come out of the conversation, and coming into it even a step further back from that to just get to know each other, understand priorities and perspectives, and not come in with a set number, you know, set questions that you want answered by these constituents.
Absolutely. I think that's a really nice lead in to our next slide.
And I just said, sorry,
oh, yeah.
I have an interesting comment here, which I want just to challenge you in this, because I think we can all agree that we're on the same page. But Caitlin Hale makes a very interesting point, which I just want to reflect very briefly on it because it will be part of our conversation, is providing opportunities for them to be part of your organization or efforts, providing what they want to be part of. So it involves culture and access to community building. I think that's great. And in principle, I completely agree with what Caitlin's saying, but it's also asking the opposite question, as it was mentioned. It's a two-way. Is your organization ready to be able to offer this type of opportunities? Is your organization, staff, leadership ready to get out of their comfort zone? Because especially when we are brought into discussions about diversity and inclusion, about outreach to communities of color, or whatever you want to call it, there's always like, yeah, I always start by saying like diversity and inclusion doesn't come because of or it's not mandated because of a memo, or because now the board of directors decided to. It really it's a painful, it's a resource intense process. Let's not sugarcoat it, but it's worth doing. So it's really, once you start and once you decide that you're gonna bring others, are you ready for those type of conversations? Are you ready to have a volunteer experience that you've probably been doing a certain type of events for decades or for years or whatever, and you have to change, to shift, need more. So it's important to be thinking that it's, yes, a community engagement, it's both ways. It's not only opening and having that notion, but also making sure that you're ready for that kind of engagement. So I just wanted to reflect on that Caitlin proud maybe with that comment.
Thank you for flagging that. I think I can speak a little more to that in this next slide too. So I think one way of framing engagement is, a lot of people were talking about outreach. I think another useful way to frame things is engagement versus transactions, which I think outreach can be transactional. So engagement is collaborative. So I think that gets at that two-way street, and taking that step back that I believe it was Rebecca who was talking about, of like not coming with your predetermined agenda, but really building something together of mutual benefit. It's relational, it's very relationship based, and your relationship to the community and what has the history been there. It is long term, so it's not just I need to accomplish this deliverable in my grant, or like I want to get input on this one specific thing. It is you're building a relationship for the long term. It is transparent. You come to the conversation with your cards laid bare. I think one thing that we should all really think about is that we're all human beings, and we can tell when someone is coming to extract something, or because they want something from us. So the more transparent you are, even if you have ulterior motives or you have specific like deliverables that you're coming with, the more transparent you can be about that, the more honest the folks you're trying to engage can be about questioning that or deciding if they want to get involved. It's best to lead with honesty and transparency, and then based on mutual interest or experience, and sometimes that is built. So not necessarily from the get-go, but again, through collaboration and identifying mutual benefits. And I think part of what Felipe was talking about your organization being ready is also showing up for priorities of members of your community. So what are the intersections of your work and the things that they're working on, or whether it's an organization or just a neighborhood. It goes both ways, right? If you want them to show up for your stuff, then in what ways are you going to show up and support them? Transactions, on the other hand, are often one-sided, typically more extractive, short-term, and often are for the benefit of one more than the other. So the next thing I want to move into is another reflection question for you all to reflect on the key questions you might ask when considering how and why to engage members of a community. And again, take the time you need to reflect on this and go ahead and type your responses in the chat. I'm going to come up with the presentation mode again. Really good responses coming in. Yay, we have such a thoughtful group. I really like the time, resources, and capacity question. I think that is essential. I think people often underestimate the amount of time, effort, and capacity it takes to do this work well and have it be fruitful.
Yeah, and sort of what a comment that I was, that comes from my last intervention was, it really resource heavy, like to do it right, and you probably all have experienced it, but for instance, on my particular experience and area of expertise, Latinos, translating a flyer or having a Google Translate website is not enough. It's not a strategy for outreach. It helps and it's always welcome, but it's really building that capacity, it's building those resources, it's building that internal structure to really be able to do it right, to do it well, and to scale it. So thank you for that question.
There's some folks that I think are making statements here, and I want to maybe call on you to frame these in more in terms of like questions to ask, like you've identified something, and so what are some appropriate questions to ask about? Like, so I'm looking here at Caitlin's comment about in the most urban section of our watershed, over 60% of high school students are Latinx. If we aren't reaching out to Latinx communities, we're failing our mission to engage all stakeholders in the watershed, plain and simple. So I think in terms of engagement then, like what are some questions you might ask yourself about how and why you engage them? Because I think them being, I think one thing is them being a majority or a large portion of the population, but I don't know that that's enough to say, oh, it is appropriate for us to engage them. So would love if you want to come off of mute or if you want to add more in the chat. Is there anything else you're seeing, Felipe, that you want to?
The one about trust, does this can have a reason to trust me, to be open with me? That's a real interesting and I mean, deserves a session by itself. I mean, in any given day, communities of color trust in authorities, in everybody who's in a position of authority or power, especially talking about their public lands, it's always tricky. But in these particular years and in this particular political environment, it's really tricky. We're very lucky to be working with the Forest Service and the Park Service. And that's something that we always want to make sure that they are cognizant about, that at the end of the day, they're anywhere from their uniforms, they might look like a police or law enforcement, to all the way to ICE or immigration. So it is important to create those avenues for trust. I'm not saying that it's impossible, I'm saying I should do that, but it's important. Also, there's natural distrust from the communities, and in many ways, or in many times, organizations, especially when there's big stimulus money or stuff, they come in with lots of money that they need to spend, and like, let's do a transactional a relation, and there's nothing left for the community after a couple of months or a couple of during a period of time. So I think trust is something, and it's back to our initial thinking about the resources, the time resource, and the time investments, really building that trust, and it's really getting in with the community leaders. It's really working with those who already have the trust, and providing of the communities that we're trying to engage, and providing them the resources, the knowledge, the programming that will resonate, that resonates with their community, and that it benefits their community. So I think trust is such an important element. So that was one that stood up, that I wanted to highlight.
Yeah. I really like the, are we willing to act on what we hear? I think that is a big, messy question, but a really great question to ask. And I think there can be multiple things associated with that. Again, the like time, capacity, resources thing, culture, mission, etc. So I really appreciate that question. Cool. I'm gonna move on to the next slide. Thank you all for your feedback. So these are some key questions that I suggest asking. I think some of this has been covered in your comments, so really appreciate your thoughtfulness. I think this question of who and what I'm representing, so thinking like even back to our diversity statement, at the beginning, the diversity welcome, excuse me, at the beginning, who are you welcoming? Think about how do I want to show up? So again, like thinking about community agreements, how do you lead with your values, your personal values, your organizational values? Are you centering and grounding yourself in your values? What am I hoping to achieve? Who am I trying to reach? And transparency is only possible when you're sure of who you are and what you bring, what you represent. So getting really grounded in some of these questions. What is my current relationship to this community, if any? So understanding the history of whether it's, you know, a 1 block radius or a neighborhood or an entire city that you're calling a community. I think getting clear on the definition of community, and any history that your organization or organizations like yours have to this community already. I think that plays into the trust thing as well, if trust is absent or has already been built. What are my resources, time, staff, and funding? And then what are my limitations? So again, getting at that question of, are we willing to act on things if, based on what we hear? So anyway, I want to invite more conversation in the chat. If you have any reflections on this, if you want to come off of mute and ask questions or add to this.
There's a very interesting question from Caitlin and seconded by Eileen about funding. It's always a tricky part, and it's always an interesting choice. I know, especially nowadays, you've probably seen a lot more funding opportunities to do this type of work, to do diversity and inclusion. Obviously, that's a result of the Black Lives Matter and all the changes that are happening in our society. However, obviously, we hope this lasts for a long time, but we know that funding and philanthropy likes to work in trends, and whatever is the big thing that they do. So, well, this last is good, but what I would recommend is making sure that in every program that you put out there, for every grant that you apply for, have always that line item or that line item, yeah, will be for diversity and inclusion. I come from a communications background, so I always said the same thing. And for whatever type of grant you're writing, make sure that communications, that your press release or your website or whatever it is, not an afterthought, because then it becomes messy, that you plan it from the beginning. Well, it's the same thing with diversity and inclusion. Make sure that it is always part, even if it's not the main purpose of your grant or your funding application or whatever you're doing. Make sure that you always integrate, because that helps. And hiring, the ultimate, hiring staff or having resources available in different languages, it's something that you can really be working through time. So my advice is always make sure that you're building those elements, and if 10, 30%, 20%, whatever it is, to diversity, to reach diverse, especially if you're living in and that or your work is done in these areas where there's a diverse art community.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I would.
Yeah, go ahead for it.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I would add on to that like, especially if you are a historic grantee and like you have a pretty established relationship with your funder, I think there's an opportunity. Well, for one thing, I think funding is kind of understanding and trying to change their model in some instances, and recognizing that, this is really important, and that there's ideas around community-centric funding, and just recognizing like the capacity and consistency that doing this kind of work and doing it well takes. But I think you know, you also have to advocate for it, and have those conversations with your program officers or whoever it is about the need for consistency around this, and that capacity needs to be put toward it. I think there's also conversations you can have around funding for actual communities and organizations that you're working with. So, and that it shouldn't all be the responsibility of you to build the capacity of these smaller organizations. But for sure, I think if you are in a larger organization in a position of power by receiving larger grants, I think it is incumbent on you to have those difficult conversations with your funders, especially if this is something they identify as a priority, being really honest and direct with them about what it takes to do the work and what that would look like in a grant. I also want to call out what Amy brought up, is that COVID has directly impacted the way that we do everything, including engaging with the community. And sometimes, you know, the groups that we're working with are pretty limited in their resources. So, or, you know, just busy doing like really on the ground direct response things. And so asking them to show up to a Zoom engagement session can be difficult. But I think I think it's partly about rethinking the resources that you have and how to offset that challenge. So whether it's like increasing access to internet or like gift cards or stipends or whatever for engagement in this setting, like how can you figure out ways to engage safely and not lose different, you know, partners in your community.
Yes, Gloria makes a comment about funding opportunities to organizations in the community with whom you're building relationships. Also, I mean, it's important, and I will actually make your cases much stronger if you bring them to the table from the get-go, from the solicitation process, when you bring them in, when you make them part, rather than just, again, avoiding that savior complex where I get the money and I'll give you and I'll tell you how to manage it. No, I mean, a lot of these organizations, community organizations, may have the sophistication, may have the ideas, and to be honest, at this point right now, there's a lot more openness to fund organizations that are driven or that are led by the community, by people of color. So again, it's just stepping out of your comfort zone. But it's a good one. And Amy, we'll talk a little bit about our shift. I mean, to be honest, we in Puerto Rico, only last weekend was when we actually had our first volunteer program since the beginning of the pandemic. We've been engaged, we've been continuing, we've been doing others. We had to check, but yes, it is something that we have been testing, that we've been trying, that we've been thinking how do we evolve and how do we adapt to the new reality of COVID. And before, it was a great success to have 50, 60, 100 people in an event. Now we cannot responsibly do that. So completely agree. But
yeah.
I'll talk a little bit during the presentation.
Yeah, and one more thing I will just add to that, and maybe it comes, I can't remember if it'll come up in our next slide, is just like priorities might shift and be more dynamic with the groups that you're trying to engage or the community that you're trying to engage. And so one way to say, okay, well, we can't host this like engagement session where we're going to talk about the intersection of you know, how they engage with the watershed and pollution, concerns about pollution, but like they're really concerned about food access in the midst of a pandemic and getting food to their elderly population. So how can you show up? It's that thing that I was talking about before with the two-way relationship. How can you show up for what the actual need is right then and there? And like finding connections to your work. It might not be super obvious, but I think that's part of the long-term, like true relationship building. Okay, so choosing where and how to engage. Some important things to keep in mind is identifying conveners and convenings, who is organizing, who are they organizing, and where. So, and this partly goes back to like, what is your history with the community that you're trying to engage, but trying to assess what is actually already going on. You're not just dropping into a blank slate. So what's already happening? Being realistic about your capacity, starting small, and being intentional about your relationship building. Recognizing that communities are not monoliths, so the Latinx community can have both shared and diverging experiences, and that one representative does not speak for all. I think Felipe can speak to this a little bit too, but that, you know, each community has its own political, just like we have political dynamics among organizations of similar sizes or partners or things like that. You kind of have to work with more than one person to really get the full picture, and understand what it means to work with one organization or over another and what their relationship is. And then be prepared for rejection. Recognize your power and privilege, and that not all communities will be open to engaging with you at first. That doesn't mean give up, but it means, you know, you got a little work to do. Felipe, do you have anything to add to this slide?
Rejection might be part of the process. Don't expect that they will always, that communities, organizations will, just because you come from, especially if you come from a larger organization or more established, that they will welcome you with their open arms. That it's part of the process, part of building that trust. They may say no a couple of times until they get to a yes. So completely agree.
Okay. And so I do want to circle back to this and just have a little bit of conversation about our current context. Virtual relationship building and convenings are hard. It's not only hard to pull off logistically, but it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't give me the same energy that meeting with people in person and building relationships in person does. So just, you know, have some compassion for yourself that this is an uphill battle a little bit, more than it already was. And that, yeah, just acknowledge that it's difficult, but it's worthwhile. Living through this pandemic, climate disasters, racial injustice, and violence is really hard. So we're all, I think it's become more commonplace to show up as your full self, as a full person who's experiencing much more than what's happening in this meeting at this moment in time. So again, just some compassion for yourself and your colleagues. The pace of this work and all work may be smaller and slower than your expectations, and just accepting that. The opportunities to engage may be fewer due to competing priorities. Again, that example that I gave of just like getting food to elderly people in the midst of a pandemic might take priority over other kind of bigger picture, longer term issues and opportunities. And lastly, relationships matter now more than ever. It's what keeps us going, and it's what's going to get you to the point that you want to be. So again, Felipe, anything you want to add?
Nope, I think I'm ready to dig in.
Okay, great. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Felipe to talk a little bit more about his work.
And you're controlling the slides, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry. Just very briefly, these are our template, or our what do you call it? Our elevator speech or whatever. We basically bring and create culturally and linguistically relevant experiences for Latino communities to experience nature. And we believe that there is an important element to create reciprocity relationships with the land. We know and scientifically proven that we have that being outdoors, that connecting with the land brings you both personal, family, community benefits, but we also want to give back. So we try to foster those reciprocity relationships with Latino communities. Next slide, please. You probably heard a lot of ways of referring, especially Latinx has been a very newly used term. Some of us prefer Latinos, others prefer Hispanic. So it is just a matter, like whatever your choice of words is, depending on your target audience, but just want to make sure that you guys know that there's there's the differences: Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, big debates. People, especially younger generations, prefer Latinx because of the non-binary gender neutral term. Others prefer Latino, and even others do on the more conservative thinking prefer Hispanic. So what I would recommend is use what works best for your community. Again, if you're talking to younger generations, probably Latinx it's a good bet. If you're talking to Spanish dominant older generations, maybe Latino. And if you're talking in a very conservative, use Hispanic. Just the only recommendation that we can give you is be consistent and know your audience, because again, we can spend 2 hours debating which one's right, which one's wrong, polling. It's really not as important as just making sure that whatever term you use it in a way that it's conscious and that it's strategic. Next slide, please. Any thoughts on that? Wanted to share. But anyhow, so here's a quick, and probably Amy will know the answer on this, but to understand how complex and diverse the Latino community is, we always like playing this game. So everybody would agree that the image on the left, it's a cake, but would like a quick poll on in the chat box. How would you call it if you speak or have taken any Spanish lessons, or you know a little bit of Spanish? How would you call it? A pastel, a bizcocho, a torta, or any other way? So quick poll. Pastel, good. Jen says pastel. Pastel, good. Any other? No else? Everybody said, oh, well, everybody can say there was a very consistent group. Yes, can we go back to the last one very quick? Pastel, bizcocho. Yes, the three are correct. The pastel, it's more likely in Mexico, Central America, bizcocho, Puerto Rico, a torta in South America. They're all correct ways of calling it a pastel. However, next slide, if you already saw it, a torta in Mexico is a sandwich. So if you are asking for a torta or an Argentinian asking, or a South American asking for a torta in a Mexican pastry, you will get a very different product what you're expecting. So it's important to know those differences. It's important to know that the Latino community comes from at least 20 countries of origin plus Puerto Rico. We are a very diverse, a very complex segment of the population. And it's just important to know those differences. I'm not trying to complicate things or make things scare you away, but it's important to know those differences, because it does matter if you're reaching a Latino community in San Juan or in Texas or in Miami versus Orlando. There's differences, and you just because a word, a term, even an approach can be very, very different, and it can be the difference between making or being successful or not. Next slide, please. So it's important to know your audience, how you're doing your outreach, how you do that engagement, and most important is how understanding that audience. It is a lot of mistakes that I've seen, or a lot of areas of improvement that I've seen over the years, is that organizations may say like, oh, let's bring somebody who's Latino, whose last name is Benitez, and therefore that person will be able to communicate with all Latinos. Yes, there will be a certain level of understanding or a certain level of opportunity to engage, but it's really about digging. And one of the reasons that Corazón Latino is successful is because we adapt to wherever we are. It's knowing the difference between a pastel, a bizcocho, or a empanada and an arepa, which are they're the same, just like well, not the same. They're very similar, but just how you call them differently, how you call them for different communities. So it's important to know the difference. So next slide, please. However, there's common ground. I mean, there's Language is, at the end of the day, Spanish, and at the end of the day, the Real Academia de la Lengua Española, the Royal Academy of the Language will dictate what or will tell you what are the proper grammar ways of using Spanish. There's cultural similarities, not only of the Latino communities, but communities of color. We're family oriented, and when we're talking about family oriented, it's not just the dad, mom, or dad, mom, and the kids. It's the tios, the tias, the neighbors that you consider part of the family. So there's this notion of family inclusion. Music and arts, food, dance, fiesta. It's always good elements that you cannot go wrong. Like a good Zumba class will resonate with Puerto Ricans or with Argentinians. Rules of thumb: for recent arrivals, preference Spanish, first generation English, Spanish, or Spanglish, second generation English or Spanglish. So it's important also to know, and again, considerations that you need to do whenever. There was a comment early on about youth. Well, are you going to talk to that youth in Spanish, in English, both languages? What cultural references can you make? What are the proper mechanisms to do that? Are you going to use Univision to advertise your event, or are you going to use TikTok? What are those different elements? And again, it's just a basic. It's basic in terms of basic. Market and audience understanding, but just have those considerations we're talking again, because we've seen over and over where things like, oh, we just translate to Spanish and therefore Latinos will show up, and usually they don't show up, and then they say, well, that's because they don't care about our issues. They don't care about clean rivers or protecting the land. Next slide, please. The way Corazón Latino does it, we do what we call a surround sound, in which we use digital strategies, grassroots activations, or even in-person events and traditional media. So we do this when we're trying to engage a community, whether it's in Puerto Rico, whether it's in Maryland, or even right now I'm in West Virginia. We try to use those elements. Obviously, the grassroots activities and activations have been delayed or have been postponed until COVID, but usually that's what we do. So we want to inform communities about the importance of National Public Lands Day, or about keeping or a volunteer opportunity with rivers. We want to make sure that we offer the three elements. So think about it in a comprehensive, not one tactic will be enough. Just want to make sure that you're using different, and same way in ways to communicate with them. Local newspaper, or maybe some canvassing, just flyers, but also consider, we actually, one of the ways we are very successful in engaging Latino communities, especially Spanish speaking, it's through Facebook. Facebook actually gives us a great opportunity and much more cost efficient than many of the others. So just think about all of those elements when you're thinking on when you're designing your outreach strategies with Latino communities. Next slide, please. Make sure that whatever events, whatever content, whatever outreach material you put out, the Woodsdale Conservation Corps, I'll explain in a second. Make sure that it's inclusive, that you reduce barriers of entries, bilingual preferably, culturally relevant, that you provide simple instructions, that you talk about safety, and there's always a call to action. So those are the different elements that we always do when we have events. So just to respond to what the Woodsdale Conservation Corps, I'm sorry about that, should have spelled it out. So the Woodsdale Conservation Corps is a program that we run on behalf of the Forest Service, in which we create groups of young ambassadors that depending on where they're part of the country, depending on the community needs, they create an engagement opportunity for them, for themselves, for their peers, and for the family. So this program started in Houston, and it was with high school and early college students that help develop programs for high school, creating tree plantings, community gardens, and it went to have them, some of them actually became or took careers in the conservation area and the land management area. So it was very interesting. So that was replicated, and the anchor or the face of this is Woodsy Owl. So you probably, for those who may remember, Don't Give a Hoot, Don't Pollute. It's one of our national icons. The other one being the Smokey Bear, but Woodsy it's a much more active, conservation-driven icon, and people love Woodsy. And you put out Woodsy in a costume, or you put a sticker of Woodsy. People anywhere from kids all the way to older adults, Woodsy is a great. So right now we have Woodsy Owl Conservation Corps units or programs in Arizona, in Utah, in Puerto Rico, in the DC area, and obviously the original one in Houston, and we're looking into expanding. And we provide them with resources in terms of trainings, materials, funding for volunteer opportunities, and it's a really beautiful program. So that's a model we use with the Forest Service. So, and again, each community, each group of youth really analyzes and proposes what are they going to focus. Like right now in Utah, for example, there's going to be some citizen science and on a river-based activities, and the construction of a trail that or the maintenance of a trail that passes through the school, and it's a school that's, I believe, 60 to 70% Latino. So it's a fun project. So if you want to know more about it, you can shoot me an email and we can see if we can create other Woodsy Owl units around the country. Next slide, please. So I was talking a little bit about creating opportunities that are relevant, that resonate, but at the same time that provide participants with elements about conservation, about volunteerism, citizen science, or just generally ways to understand, care for our public lands and waters. So this one was a very interesting one. We launched as part of the of a global citizen science competition. It's the City Nature Challenge. So basically, cities around the world have a friendly competition using this app, iNaturalist. I don't know if you guys have used it. One of the many apps that help you identify flora and fauna. And so usually in April, probably April, May, there's a big event around the world. So you create teams that compete, or cities that compete around the world, I'm sorry, on who can make the most observations and identifications. So we created in a Latino-oriented, in which we invited them in the Cheverly area. And we started, okay, we're gonna use citizen science. We're gonna use it very technical. We're gonna have a couple of even scientists from the Forest Service helping us there. But how can we make it inclusive? How can we make it exciting? And it's just not like, just an activity that where you bring your iPhone, take a couple of pictures, and they go home. So the way we did it, that's how we started designing our events. Was we started with a nice icebreaker, and the best icebreaker that we know is dance. So we have actually a Zumba class of 2 or 3 songs at the beginning of the event. So that pretty much breaks the ice, and whoever doesn't know each other at that point, either by observing or by doing the dance, people are already, then we spend some time explaining them about what they're going to do, explaining with the family, and this is a family-oriented activity. So the parents are teaching the kids and the kids are teaching the parents. We make sure that each event has activities for all ages. So I should have started. Our recommendation is always to not do events on a Saturday morning or a Saturday even midday, because if you're talking about immigrant communities, it's very likely that they'll still be working. Usually if they work in the service industry, whatever, Saturday is the work day for them. So we do it on a Sunday, but also don't do it before noon or during the noontime, because then you're competing with God and that's not gonna end well for you. So you do it in the afternoon. So we have an event at 4 or 5 p.m. in the afternoon where we bring these elements, where we pretty much throw a party at the park or at the forest. and we make them feel engaged. We make them feel welcomed. We give them explanations, as I mentioned, about the science, but at the same time, we're trying to create an opportunity. And if they're coming after church, they will be dressed in their church clothes, and they will bring the kids, but they will bring all the way to the abuelitos, to the grandparents. So you want to make sure that you have activities for all of them and ways to engage. And at the end of the day, or at the end of the 90 minutes or 2-hour session, we give some finger food, some empanadas or some pupusas. And it's a way, again, that those cultural elements that help bring people together, which is dance, which is working with families, and food. So that's our model. That's how we do, and we try to replicate it in many different ways. Next slide, please. We bring the kids and we help them become excited about science. For example, if you guys have used this app called iNaturalist, iTree, sorry. iTree basically helps you measure the ecological values and the ecological services that trees provide, even to a monetary, like how much money, if you have trees planted outside a building, how much energy they're saving. So it gives you actual money numbers. So one of their different applications, which everything is online, it's free to use. It provides you like this card, like the USDA food information cards. So what we did was we went out in Kenilworth Gardens in Washington, D.C., which, by the way, still going through a emerald ash borer infestation problem. So we wanted to show them what was going on. We have a scientist from the Forest Service explaining them what was going on, we help them, we teach the kids and the parents how to use this, what's the measure, and then what's the importance of these trees, not only because to go beyond the like, oh yeah, they're pretty and they make me feel good. No, there's value on trees in many different ways. And we get kids to do it, and we get kids to measure the circumference of a tree, which was a lot of fun, because they were first measuring the circumference of the trunk of a tree, and then they were measuring their circumference of their dads. And I mean, it was a lot of fun. So I and when we were doing this, we were building and bringing more members of the community, bringing more organizations. And there's organizations that will already have the relationship and the trust of the community. What you can bring, its knowledge, its expertise, its programs that very likely they align with their mission. So it's just an interesting opportunity. So again, we're not experts in emerald ash borer infestation, but the Forest Services. So we bring them as a partners. We are experts in reaching Latino communities. So it's just creating those relationships that make sure that are welcoming, and again, that are part of a broader educational or volunteer or a conservation program. Next slide, please. And I'm gonna try to be fast. So, I mean, it's just examples of how this type of activities really bring families together. And I love this picture because you have the little one in the hat with the Corazón Latino. That's Alex, my son, where you bring toddlers all the way to teenagers that are basically, and that's Woodsy, by the way. Here's Woodsy. So in that event, we actually, the one that I was mentioning, we actually measured the trees with all this, and we ended up, because it's harder to do that, we ended up planting a tree, a symbolic tree that of all these things that we've learned. So just, again, doing it in a culturally and linguistically appropriate way. Next slide, please. Okay, then another element, and is there any questions to this point before I go into the next topic? No questions? Everybody's loving it? Hating it? Everybody's asleep? No? All right. Got great point. How does transportation work? We try to choose sites that are accessible by public transportation. We in case when that's not a good solution, we try to provide stipends. We're allowed in some of our funding to provide stipends to those who can bring folks. Or on the worst case scenario, we actually did on the Shenandoah River, a big event. We actually rented buses and just got people. And it is, and when you provide those kind of transportation or those kinds of solution, it's also a challenge because, I mean, I remember receiving a call. We usually, when we have these events where we're bringing people or transporting them, and obviously we have to do all the waivers and all that stuff, but we will usually add in the flyer or whatever, however we're inviting them, and a telephone number where they can talk to somebody about what to expect, what to bring, is it safe, even very basically like, hey, can I bring my 3-year-old and my 10-year-old? What should I bring for food? Is there food provided? Whatever it is. And it takes trust. And to be honest, at some point, in a joking way, I remember one of our community engagement experts received the question while we're on our way from DC to Shenandoah. Well, like, hey, are you going to harvest our organs after this? Like, it was joking, but at the same time, why are you giving me this for free? What is it for me? We try to minimize the entry cost. Like, sometimes folks think, or there's the notion in this philosophy, which works in other communities, that if you don't pay for something, you don't value it, which is correct. And I think it does make sense, but even a $5 entry fee or to cover cost, if you're talking about a family of 4 or $5 a piece, and maybe making minimum wage, it adds up. So yes, we try as much as we can to either have transportation, metro accessible or public transportation accessible, or we provide those elements. But yeah, that's a really great question. So how would you deliver this post-COVID? Oh, that's a great question. So we've actually done a lot in 2 ways. We're actually doing a lot of online activation. So we try to teach, we try to provide amusement. We actually have done a series of concerts, online concerts, which actually we've become really good at, where we bring elements of the outdoors with music to the people, and we integrate all those elements of conservation education, environmental protection, whatever it is, protection of our public lands. So we actually co-hosted with the National Environmental Foundation and Toyota the National Public Lands Day event this year, which, as you probably know, National Public Lands Day is the largest volunteer day for our public lands. And we actually did a series of concerts from different public lands, from Joshua Tree National Park, different from Hawaii. So what we're trying to do is bring those elements, bring nature now through online. And what we do is we create these events in Facebook, and it was mentioned early on about Zoom. We need to acknowledge that the equivalent of a transportation, or not having a car or a vehicle to go to a public land in COVID days, is not having the proper device or not having reliable internet in your house. So when you're expecting to have people to join a Zoom call, communities of color, Latino communities at least, it's very unlikely that they will do it. I mean, look, we've learned a lot, and there's a lot of best practices right now with the education, online education, and how schools have been trying to minimize those barriers. But that's another one. And then the other one that we're trying to do is it's a hybrid, where we are actually providing the educational component that we will traditionally do in an event on a presentation. We'll do it online, and then encourage folks to go on their own to do whatever, if it's a volunteer opportunity, or if it's just a walk, or just to use iNaturalist, whatever it is. So we've been testing a little bit, but yeah, no, it's been River Network actually did a really interesting test in Arizona with a river cleanup with Literati. You probably heard of this app that helps you quantify how much trash you pick up. And I think that were very interesting and very encouraging results there. I mean, it's still, you need to download, you need to use the app. There's a lot of steps, but that's what we are doing. And the way we're doing right now in Puerto Rico, where we're starting to venture out, is we obviously keep either families on, like if there's a tree planting or a river cleanup or a beach cleanup, we try to create family cells, or we tap it at 10 individuals, and we follow very strict COVID protocols. Like I mean, we go beyond what CDC and other guidelines, because the worst thing that can happen right now is that you get somebody infected or an outbreak on an event outdoors, and might not be good for anybody. So yeah, we're in that process. So what I would do is online, but also encouraging the individual actions, and the individual obviously will, until we have an opportunity to bring more than 30 people together. Great. Aileen says that holding online, I agree. I think that the hybrid, we're still trying to figure out it with Latino communities, because it's harder, obviously, the things that I mentioned. But we're trying to as much, and we're trying to get away from another recommendations to the kind of webinars we're doing right now, where it's only talk. We really try to do the combination of music, entertainment, and try to like create a meaningful and joyful experience, rather than just yet another webinar that they have to watch, because you probably will lose them. So yeah, we're testing, and I think we good to come back in a few more months to see how things are going, and especially as we think of the next springtime, where we will continue to figure out ways. I'm gonna go really quick. Another element that we usually are asked is about transcreation, and what is the process of creating an event or a document from English, or aim at English to Spanish speaking or other language. And I just want to make sure that you guys see this process, because it's not just as simple as like, hey, just send it to the intern who happens to speak Spanish and have that translation, or do Google Translate. Now we actually follow a process that goes, as you can see here, that goes through changes, the actual translation, revisions, and design considerations, where you can get a product that it's actually appealing, that is culturally and linguistically relevant. So next slide, just to show, and we do it you can follow us in Facebook and online, that we do this kind of processes with the Forest Service, and now with the Park Service we're launching, where we take a program that it's English facing, and we try to create the equivalent in Spanish, again, not just translating word by word, but making sure that it's relevant and resonates with the community. And I'm gonna stop there, because I think we don't have a lot of time left, and I would love to hear more thoughts, particular elements, or questions that you may have.
Yeah, so I think we don't quite have time for breakouts again, just because, you know, we try to incorporate conversation throughout the presentation. So this is good. So we did have some discussion prompts that I'm going to put in the chat really quick. But please feel free to continue to use the chat box or come off of mute if you feel comfortable, and share or ask questions. But these are some of the things we were thinking of having you think about. So how have I ensured my approach to engagement is focused? My approach is engagement focused rather than transactional. How am I working within the community and its existing context? So working with established conveners. What are the barriers to proper engagement that maybe you want to workshop here in this space? What are the opportunities, and what sorts of questions are still lingering for you all?
Or even just going to, like, if there's a specific event or a specific idea that you have, happy to brainstorm. It's also a good process. Very shy today.
This is Rebecca. one place that we're looking to do community engagement is around a dam removal. And as you can imagine, these are always tense conversations with a bunch of different stakeholder groups, but the neighborhoods near where the removal is occurring, it's a predominantly Black neighborhood, and they will be impacted by the restoration and changes to a local park. And we've been thinking about how to do meaningful engagement with that group related to this dam removal. So if you have any words of wisdom, I'd welcome them.
I mean, I think it's a great example of community engagement 101, to make sure that you talk to the community leaders, talk to the churches, talk to organizations that are established, and just get their input on how to best communicate with the community. It might be that you organize an event, might be that you have maybe some flyer distribution at the service. Again, I'm just telling you because I don't necessarily, it's not my area of expertise, African American community, although we do a lot of work that it's very similar. But yeah, just listen and ask them explain them what you will learn a lot about what are the pushback that you may hear, and just establish those conversations, those two-way conversations, and they'll probably, I mean, if it's good for the community, probably would be on board, and they will help you do the outreach. But I will definitely go to those, especially if you don't go to those or if you don't have them already, go to those leaders, go to those places where there's community leadership, and just figure out. And there's many ways. I mean, it's obviously economic impact, but I think something that everybody will agree on is just making sure that these projects are a way to improve the present and the future of your kids, of the most vulnerable, and even if there's a faith-based angle. And I eliminated that slide, but we actually have worked, and very successfully, with faith-based organizations, especially with Catholic groups and churches, where we tie it to not necessarily to the typical conservation or climate talking points, but we actually bring it to what Pope Francis did with the encyclical, where we talk about the protecting our common house. And there, I remember the priest that actually helped us or facilitated one of our events. He said, like, there's two ways that you can learn about God's creation. One is reading the Bible, and the other one is by looking at nature. And we are here to protect and care for our God's creation, and that actually helped us. We planted 500 trees with a group of 30. So it was very, very convincing. So finding those elements, finding those type of messages that will resonate best with your community.
Yeah, I want to just add to this too. Like, I feel like community engagement has become a very like in vogue term, and people think like, yeah, this is the way. But they're like, true community engagement is very not glamorous, and it takes a lot of grunt work. So I think about like, if you're really truly trying to establish, like speaking to what Felipe was talking about finding the conveners, who are the community leaders, like oftentimes that's like, you know, just using Google, trying to find events happening in the community, showing up to them, cold calling, emailing. I mean, oftentimes when we're talking about smaller organizations that are volunteer run, it's going to take a lot of like beating down the door to get someone to respond to you, a lot of persistence. So yeah, like I said, it's not very glamorous work, and it's kind of like wild and can be hectic, but I really want to emphasize the like showing up to events, whether it's like, you know, working with religious leaders and showing up to the events that they're convening, or community organizations, but meeting people where they're at, I think really demonstrates a lot, and is the best way to get in touch with people. I recognize in a COVID world that looks different now, but the other thing I wanted to highlight was if you don't have a professional connection, I think what a lot of community organizers do and people in their and working for community organizations do is utilize personal networks, which is maybe something that is people working for larger organizations or haven't done this before need to get used to. Of like, if you have a personal connection to someone in a community, for sure bring that into this, even though like they might not be working on the issue that you're working on. You know, finding the degrees of separation to make that connection.
And if I were for a Latino activation, a Latino, and if you're not already know or have identified those groups, obviously in a post-COVID or a pre-COVID world, what I would do is like show up to and maybe try to get a booth or something in a Latino, could be Cinco de Mayo, Hispanic Heritage Month, or Dia de las Madres. I mean, depending on what part of the country, there's these opportunities for engagement, and just talk to the people that are presenting there, that have booths, because those are going to be your partners. Right now, obviously, it's harder, but there's still some engagement opportunities. What was mentioned before in terms of the the need to provide food for families right now. So we actually, since the beginning of the pandemic, we shifted a little bit our ground operation to support those food distribution projects where as part of the USDA farmer to families food box distribution, we actually activated our networks in Puerto Rico, in Arizona, and in the Maryland area to get people food. And that's also a good opportunity where you can slip a flyer, when you can do ask them if they have filled the census or they're registered to vote. So it's a little bit stepping out of our comfort zone and trying to find ways to do, because there's still ways right now, and right now, I mean, folks are looking for these new engagement opportunities, and if you are able to take a look at our work in our Facebook page or in our website, you'll see some of those ideas, and again, something may spark some interest and some ideas in your local community.
I want to highlight this comment that Gloria, or this question that Gloria just asked here about working to have unity hikes between Black and Brown communities in the spring, working out the details, but what do you recommend we include in the day? How to connect the healing of communities of color with nature.
Oh, we have a lot going on that. Well, there's a lot of great practices that we've been fostering, and we've been testing. One of them is forest therapy, and it's, let's be honest, it's a very wide practice like yoga, but actually it has provided us with a lot of great avenues, and we actually help and funded, supported the funding of Latino and Spanish-speaking guides of forest therapy. But I do think that's the reason, and we've been encouraging. And one of our messaging that you will probably see in all of our concerts and all the work that we do is that now more than ever we need to connect with nature. That this is the moment that nature can be, if you are lucky enough that you can go to a national forest or a national park or at your neighborhood park, that's great. But even in your own home, even just looking at the window to the tree neck in your street, or having a little plantita, some plants in your house, that helps. And right now there's some research that shows that 5 minutes in nature will give you the benefits of like a 2-hour hike in terms of mindfulness, in terms of relaxation, in terms of decreasing. So we are actually prior to the election, we're going to be launching with one of our close partners, Dr. Susan Bartlett, this 5 minutes in nature. Like, if nobody can tell me that you can have 5 minutes for yourself. And it can be even just, we actually created that. Sorry, I'm going to, it's a topic that is very close to us. We actually created in our website a meditation app, something like the Calm app, but actually you go to the website and you can it's a guided meditation with sounds and sounds of El Yunque, and show some pretty images of public lands. all of those things help, all of those. And so encourage it right now in making sure that people do it in their in an individual or family basis. But once we can, I do think that having those conversations, having those healing spaces, either facilitated or not, I think it is the best thing that we can be doing for our communities. But thank you. That's a really great comment. Michael has a quick question. Focusing on the rapid heads about the meaningful engagement. I would because sorry, Michael is talking about having visitors from out of town that it's harder to like identify if they're Puerto Ricans in New York or Dominicans or what or Mexican descent. I think in those type of situations where you don't have a clear identification of who you are, I think probably because in New York there's probably a high that it's Caribbean, and that was just my wild guess. I might be wrong. It might be Mexican, but at the end of the day, we all like salsa and we all like mariachis. So making sure that there is events or that there are opportunities and engagement that resonate, that are colorful, that bring those elements of Latinidad are important. In terms of language, if you have a process or you have a translator that's doing this work, try to ask them to do something that is neutral Spanish, which is the safest bet. So that way you're not into over complicated. And you can reach out to me and I can give you some specific, but I think at the end of the day, you don't have to have I mean, everybody loves Bad Bunny. So putting Bad Bunny or a good mariachi music will resonate with everybody. So I wouldn't get too in the deep, especially if you have such a diverse community coming from the other. I wouldn't be that worried to be explicitly worried when you're doing a more specific targeted outreach to a certain community that lives next to a river or next to a park. Then you need to look into that. But for that, I think it's a generic, as long as it's relevant, as long as and it really resonates with Latinos, I think it should be okay.
I also wonder, like, I think this is a really interesting issue and one that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking through, but I appreciate you bringing it up. I think, like, well, first of all, I have questions about like how you're identifying that they're visiting from out of town and like how you are gathering information about who's showing up. But I also wonder if there are organizations, like there are reasons that they're being directed to this specific area, and if they're associated with community groups or organizations that are getting them out there, and if you can connect with like a larger organizing force there. And I also think about just like maybe hosting events or sessions that, like, if you're visiting from this area of this background, like, we'd love to talk to you about the river, or like hold a specific session geared toward you all. This is not like a fully baked thought process, but
yeah, and I'm going to jump in and throw Lindsay Larson on the spot and have her talk about how we've collected information from visitors to understand where they're coming from. If she's at the computer.
Yeah, hi. I know we're short on time, so we've done visitor surveys over the past few years and learned a lot about where they're coming from, and we think that it's mostly word of mouth. Folks learn about these spots from friends and family, and then come up in family groups. So we've definitely thought about having focus groups specifically for visitors from New York City, for example, who identify maybe as Latinx, and that's something we're hoping to develop into the fall and winter that could be really valuable.
Are those surveys conducted both in English and Spanish, or just in English?
No, they've been in English in previous years. What we've found that there's usually someone in the group that speaks English, and we just do one survey for the whole group. But
that's a great. And do you, just asking, just because, I mean, I'm sure, I mean, just because if visitors are coming from New York City, I'm sure that's not even domestic, it's probably international visitors who will come. So I totally understand. I see your point. But also, just a word of caution when using this type of surveys and designing the instrument, it's you probably already experienced it, that sometimes Latino, especially immigrants or recent immigrants, will attend or will visit public lands at different times. So if you are thinking and you're basically doing it on a Saturday morning, you will have a lot of respondents that are more white, more mainstream. But if you do it on a Sunday afternoon or even on Monday or whatever the days off, then you get different responses. So I was always be very, very careful on how you send and when are those questionnaires completed, because that's usually where we've seen a lot of skewed answers and people making assumptions. But I'm sure you guys are capturing. But anyhow, just a thought that I can, because we've seen it time after time, like that, those type of situations. But focus groups are great. I think a lot at this point, online listening, online prompting, online conversation will also be very interesting. And to be honest, for us, when we're doing some stakeholder mapping and just listening sessions, we tend to do a lot of in-depth conversations, in-depth interviews. That's where we got a lot of our deepest insights on how to do that. But anyhow, just a couple of recommendations based on what you just mentioned.
I would just add on too, like if there are organizations within your community that might be used, like it would be good to partner with to engage these communities that are traveling from outside of the city, whether that is like an organization that focuses on Spanish speaking populations or like individuals of color and the environment, or some sort of like partnership that you can bring on to, you know, like build your capacity to engage with these folks and like bring out some more targeted programming or conversations or engagement efforts is another thing that I think of. And we are a few minutes past the hour, so we do need to wrap up. I want to flag that I've put a quick survey in the chat. If it would really help us out if you give us some feedback. This is a living presentation, so we're adapting as we receive feedback. And yeah, so with that, I'm going to close it out and say thank you all so much for joining, for your thoughtful responses and questions. These are so much fun for us, so thank you so much. And again, I will follow up on email with our contact as well as the slides from today. So thank you.
Thank you
so much. So it's great.
I would love to do some work in New York, so send me an email.